In this video, we're going to talk about solving quadratics. And before you start this lesson, some things you should be familiar with is factoring quadratics, solving equations with square roots, and the quadratic formula. So all these are ways that we've talked about solving quadratics before, and now we're just going to put them all together into a single lesson. So we now learned every way to solve a quadratic. These are all the ways that we're going to learn. All right. But however, in some circumstances, some are kind of less steps and others would be really tedious. Some you can't even use in some instances. So it's nice to have them all in your toolbox because it's going to make some problems a lot simpler if you have 3 options. All right. But also, it's a little bit up to you how you solve these problems. All right, so here's my general thought process for solving a quadratic. This isn't like a rule. You don't have to do it this way, but this is the way I think about a problem when I see it, that it's a quadratic. So as soon as I see that x squared or something squared in an equation, I know it's a quadratic, and I go through this kind of thought process. My first question is, can I use square roots to solve this problem? Generally, if you can use the square root to cancel out the x squared, then it's going to make the problem a lot less steps. Right? Mainly, there's no x term. If there's an x term like this, x squared plus x, you can't use square roots to solve that problem. All right, but if you do have something squared, you can. All right, if I can't use it square roots right away, the next thing I'm gonna do is get everything to one side of the equation and get 0 on the other. All right, so you don't have to do that first. You only do that if you recognize you can't use square roots. I get 0 over there. And now that I have 0 on one side, I have 2 options. My first option would be to try to factor the quadratic. So remember, factoring it, you're gonna break it up into its 2 pieces, and that lets you solve simpler equations. So I'd always try to factor first, because to me it's less steps, and I can kind of do it quickly if I recognize the pattern. But if I can't figure out how to factor it, maybe I've spent like a minute on it, I'm like, oh, I can't figure out how to factor this, then I'll just go to the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is some people's first thought because it solves every quadratic. But the quadratic formula can be tedious, and there's other ways to solve quicker. So that's why I use quadratic formula as my last resort, knowing that it will always work, but other ways might be faster. All right, so let's say I want to solve x squared plus 8 equals 7x. Right away, I know I'm not going to be able to use square roots to solve this equation because there's an x squared and an x. When both those are in the equation at the same time, you're not going to be able to use square roots. All right, you could do completing the square, but that's like a even more tedious process than the quadratic formula. So I might skip that. But since I can't use square roots, now I'm going to get everything to one side. I'm going to subtract 7x from both sides. So now I'm in a situation where I can either factor it or use the quadratic formula. If I want to factor it, I'm looking for 2 numbers that add together to give -7 and multiply together to give 8. All right, is that possible? 8 and 1 are going to work. So my perfect pair of numbers are going to be -8 and +1. All right, they multiply together to give, I want to multiply to give +8, not -8. So that doesn't work. All right, so it doesn't seem like I'm having a lot of success trying to factor it. So now my other option is we'll just do the quadratic formula. All right, and hopefully you're working on memorizing quadratic formula because it's going to come up a lot. But now I plug in A is 1, B is -7, C is 8. So it's going to be +7, -7 squared minus 4 times 1 times 8, all over 2 times 1. All right, now I'm just going to simplify it. Again, I'm going to go a little quicker just so the video is not super long, but 7 squared is 49. 4 times 8 is 32. And that is 17. All right. And there's nothing else I can do to simplify this. Again, you want to look at that square root and see if there's any way you can simplify the square root, but 17 is a prime number. It's not divisible by 4, 9, or 16. All right, so I can't simplify, and that's my final answer. So you can see the thought process I went through. Can't use square roots, so I get 0 on one side. Couldn't figure out how to factor it, so I do the quadratic formula. All right, next example. When I look at this one, I instantly know how I'm going to solve it. I see this thing being squared. I instantly know that I'm going to use square roots to solve this problem. All right, if you want to do any other method, you'd have to FOIL this out, distribute that in, combine like terms, and already you've wasted like 5 steps doing simplifying rather than solving. All right, so for me, I'm going to add 16 to both sides. because I want to get this thing being squared by itself. Still want to get the thing being squared by itself, so I'm going to divide both sides by 2. And by getting the thing being squared by itself, I can take the square root of both sides, because it cancels out. I get plus or minus the square root of 8. And it's up to you whether you want to simplify your square root early or later. I'll simplify my square root early. 8 is 4 times 2. And the square root of 4 is 2. So I simplify the square root. I still got to get rid of this negative 7 that's next to the x. So I got to add 7 to both sides. My final answer is x is 7 plus or minus 2 squared root of 2. All right, so that's my final answer. But the important thing to notice in this one is right away, I saw what the equation looked like. I used square roots. If I wanted to use the quadratic formula to solve this one, like I said, probably the whole page would be filled up with just trying to simplify it. And then you still have to use the whole quadratic formula. So by recognizing this early, you can save yourself a lot of time. All right, x minus 3 times x plus 2 equals 2. This one you might be like, oh, I can factor this one, just say this is x minus 3, or this is 3 and this is negative 2, but it's equal to 2, not 0. So this one, no matter which method you want to use, you're going to have to do some simplifying first. So the first thing you have to do is FOIL it. I can combine like terms. And then now I look at this equation. It's a little bit more simplified. And right away, again, I recognize that I can't use square roots because it's an x squared and an x. So my next step is going to be to subtract 2 from both sides. To get 0 on one side, because that gives me the 2 options now to either factor it or do the quadratic formula. If I want to factor this, I need to add 2 numbers to get negative 5. I need to multiply 2 numbers to get negative 8. All right, is that going to be possible? 8 and 1 is not going to work, and 4 and 2 are not going to work. All right, so this one also doesn't work. At least I can't see it right now. All right, so factoring it doesn't seem like it works, so I'm going to do the quadratic formula. Let's see, so let me write out a is 1, b is negative 5, c is negative 8. Again, your first real goal is to simplify that square root. Uh, 25 plus 32 is 57. And when you get to here, you're trying to see, are there any perfect squares that divide 57? Definitely not 4, not 9, 16, no, 25, no. So yeah, I'm pretty sure this is the final answer. All right, you can't simplify that square root any further. All right, so here's one for you to try on your own. Think about the best way to solve this and solve this quadratic. I'll show you the solution in 3, 2, 1. And the final answers I got are 5 and negative 1/2. So for this one, I recognize you can't use square roots because of the x squared and the x. Move everything over. In this case, I could factor it because I could find 2 numbers that add to negative 9 and multiply to negative 10. All right, that was my perfect pair. I taught you the splitting method, so I split this negative 9 into those 2 pieces. And then factor a couple times to get my factor quadratic. When you have your factor quadratic, you split it up into 2 simpler equations that you can solve. All right, so that's also a review of how to factor to solve a quadratic equation. You can also do this using the quadratic formula. The main thing when you're doing the quadratic formula is make sure you fully simplify. So if your final answer still had square roots or like the plus or minus in it, that means you didn't fully simplify. You should be able to get down to just these 2 answers. All right, so go ahead and practice doing this. Again, you have 3 tools at your disposal, using square roots, factoring, and using the quadratic formula. I like to encourage you to use all 3 tools when you're practicing so you can get used to using all of them, because it'll make problems a lot simpler when you have all those options.